Let's move forward. So the title of the panel is Class Exclusion or True Beliefs. Now, I've been told to keep intros to a bare minimum. Gad Saad is our first speaker, who has 20 minutes to present on parasitic ideas.
I was told 25 throughout.
Let's see how. 25. Okay. Parasitic ideas and suicidal empathy are killing the West. As many of you know, Gad is an evolutionary behavioral scientist, professor of marketing, author of The Parasitic Mind, and a forthcoming book, which I think everybody's very excited about, Suicidal Empathy. Of course, you probably listened to the Saad Truth, the podcast, and if you're like me, you see him popping up on your YouTube feed every 5 minutes. But make sure you check out his YouTube channel. Gad, the floor is yours for 25 minutes.
Thank you, sir.
Well, it's nice to meet some people in person that I only know through the online meetings. So great to meet you all. I'm going to start the clock so I can appear through 25 minutes. Apologies to the few people who were at yesterday's event. I was told that there'd be a very, very little overlap between yesterday's audience and today's audience. So if some of my incredibly funny jokes of yesterday you read them again today, apologies. But usually the tedium effect for humor takes a while to take hold. So hopefully you'll still find me funny and hopefully interesting. So what I'd like to talk about today is, of course, the parasitic mind and suicidal empathy. And let me contextualize what is the kind of unifying narrative behind these two books. So if I wish to fully zombify a human being, I need to do two things. I need to parasitize their cognitive system, hence the parasitic mind, but I also then need to zombify or parasitize your emotional system and suicidal empathy. I'll spend much of the time talking about parasitic mind, and then I'll give you a few hints of suicidal empathy. So bear with me. So there are two great wars that I have faced in my life. The first war, the one from my childhood, the Lebanese Civil War. Had I had a bit more time, I would have talked a bit more about it because there are some really interesting lessons that we can take from my childhood in terms of the lunacy that we see today. And then the second great war is the war on reason, science, logic, common sense that I've experienced or witnessed for 31 years as a professor. And it is particularly something that I've witnessed because in my own research, I apply evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biological principle in studying human behavior in general, and consumer behavior and economic behavior in particular. Now, that to me seems like a very obvious proposition that, of course, human beings, consumers, employers, employees are biological agents. But to most of my social scientist colleagues, that's crazy talk. To most of my colleagues in the business school, that's crazy talk. So I originally saw many of these parasitic ideas, which subsequently people refer to as wokeism. I saw them very early in my career in the mid-90s. And so what I'll do is I'll skip all the level of stuff. I'll just mention this slide. I'm on a leave from Concordia University because it became too dangerous for me as a outspoken Jewish professor to be at Concordia University. For those of you who think that whichever university you're at, it's laden with Jew hatred, it is child's play compared to Concordia University. Concordia University has been referred to colloquially as Gaza University for well over 20 years. So someone with my profile has a very hard time walking on campus. So I would have to go in to fix lectures surrounded by security. This is in the 21st century in Montreal, Canada. So you can try to ignore the problem, but the problem's not going to go away. This is an actual photo of the SWAT police, the Montreal City SWAT police, that is there to protect Jewish students to go into the building. This is the reality that we're seeing. Now, I said that one of the wars I faced was the war in the Lebanese Civil War, and I alluded to my scientific work. I just want to mention a few examples of the evolutionary psychology research that I've done, and I think most of you will nod and say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But if you saw the number of desk rejections I had received from journals, because I was arguing that human beings are biological beings, you simply wouldn't believe it. And so I'll just give you two examples of research I've done. In one set of studies, we looked at how imbuing men with high status via specific products. So we actually brought men, had them drive either a Porsche. And I tell people that the real accomplishment of that study was to try to convince a granting agency to give you money so that you could rent a Porsche over the weekend. And we did. And so we brought people to the lab, had them drive either a Porsche or a beaten up old car, either in downtown Montreal, which is a lek, which is a zoological term where you can sort of peacock, or on a semi-deserted highway. And the dependent measure was salivary assays, so that we could then watch what happens to your endocrinological system when you are either imbued with a social win or a social loss. Not surprisingly to anybody in this room, you put young men in a Porsche and the endocrinological system explodes. So that was the first set of studies. The second set of studies, we looked at what happens to women's beautification practices across the menstrual cycle. And so we measured women across 35 continuous days, because 35 days covers, on average, all menstrual cycle lengths. On average, it's about 28 days. And we saw, as exactly what it predicted, that during the maximally fertile phase of the menstrual cycle, this is when this is about women beautify themselves the most. This is when they wear the stilettos. This is when they don't wear, the sweatpants. This is when they wear makeup, when they're more scantily clad. In exactly the same way, in a homologous way, how other female species do it in their own ways with advanced species. So it should be a no-brainer that biology should be relevant in explaining human behavior. But the parasitized degenerates in academia thought that it was completely ridiculous that I would be applying biology. Now they're coming around to saying, oh yeah, I guess you were maybe right. And so the Parasitic Mind is really a book that I've been writing in my head for 30 plus years, even though officially it came out in 2020. So let me now explain the neuro-epistemological framework. There are basically two sets of pathogens that really affect the human condition. The first one you're all familiar with. It's the viruses, the fungi, the parasites, the bacteria that have killed untold billions of people around the world throughout history. But then I argue, of course, that there's a second class of pathogens, parasitic ideas, idea pathogens that also destroy our capacity to think, to engage in critical thinking, and so on. And so just to give you a bit of a background to how I got that idea, I started immersing myself in the parasitology literature, which is the study of host-parasite interactions. But of course, parasites, let's say in the human context, can go to different organs in your body. So a tapeworm can parasitize your intestinal tract. A neuroparasite, though, needs to end up in your brain, altering your neuronal circuitry to suit its reproductive interests typically. And so I'll give you a few examples. I won't go through all of these, but in the top one, you see a spider wasp that it stings the much larger spider, rendering it fully zombified, but fully alive, pulls it to its burrow, lays its eggs on it, and then as the eggs hatch, they eat it in vivo. And so you could think of political correctness as the spider wasp sting, right? Because it leads us quietly and meekly to the abyss of infinite lunacy. Yes, yes, men too can menstruate. Yes, yes, right? And so it's the exact same mechanism. You have become zombified. You have become parasitized. So yes, I mean, it's a metaphor, but it literally is what is happening to your capacity to reason. Because until 15 minutes ago, the 117 billion people that have existed on Earth were able to fully navigate through the conundrum of what constitutes the male and female phenotype. But after you take a course in women's study at Oberlin, you're no longer able to tackle this very, very difficult precision. But every one of our ancestors seem to have been able to navigate through this difficult problem. I'll just skip to the wood cricket because this has become a viral term that people have adopted from me when I call someone, for example, a wood cricket Jew. So the wood cricket abhors water. This image right here. It wants nothing to do with water, but when it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump into water in order for it to complete its reproductive cycle. So when a wood cricket is parasitized in this manner, it willfully will commit suicide in the service of the hairworm. So now you can start seeing how parasitic mime and suicidal empathy start going together. So let's look at some wood crickets in the human form. Queers for Palestine at the Griffith Manifestation. As I explained at yesterday's talk in London, if you're queer, more power to you. Great. If that's how you present yourself to the world, then the decision becomes, if I am queer, should I put my eggs in supporting Tel Aviv, which is one of the most queer-friendly cities in the world? Or should I put my eggs in defending a society where they've come up with a really innovative form of subversion therapy? It's a gravity-based. And we call you off the rooftop, and then the problem is solved with queers, right? But of course, when you're queers for Palestine, it's all about Gaza. Jewish Anna Epstein is a wood critic Jew because she decided at Boston University to, when after the Hamas folks did a little sortie into southern Israel, to rip down the posters of the infants, the Jewish infants. So imagine what her moral compass must look like in saying that, never mind, this wasn't that she pulled down the poster of a young man who could have been in the IBF. She was very gleefully and proudly pulling down the photos of the 4-month-old and 6-month-old babies, and she's Jewish. Now, had she been at the Nova Festival, she would have ended up in the same situation as the rest of the people who were there. But she's more enlightened, empathetic, and progressive figure. And then the third example that is going to be very famous because it's going to be in the first chapter of Suicidal Empathy is a Norwegian man who had been sodomized by a Somali immigrant. And after the Somali immigrant served a very light sentence, because in Norway they're much kinder than the rest of the world, you don't want to punish criminals. You want to rehabilitate them and reintegrate them into society very quickly. He was going to be deported back to Somalia. And that created huge amount of emotional, existential angst in the rapee, because then using Maslow's term, I'm using Maslow's term, the Somali sodomizer could not be fully self-actualized in Mogadishu. So there's that issue. But he felt guilty that the Somali rapist would not be fully flourishing. That is not an evolutionary reflex that most of us have been endowed with. This is Tal Nitzan, Jewish Tal Nitzan, with cricket Jew Tal Nitzan, who was doing her PhD at Hebrew University and who was trying to identify the rampant rape of Palestinian women by IDF soldiers. That was her work and hypothesis. To her utter dismay, when she found out that she couldn't identify a single case, even after speaking with all of the Palestinian women, it turns out that that didn't dissuade her from her sort of meta conclusion, which is that the IDF soldiers are truly evil. Well, how could it be that they are evil if none of them have raped anybody? Well, it's because the IDF soldiers so dehumanize other Palestinian women that they're not even worthy of being raped. So she found a way to take not a single instance of rape as a manifestation of her working hypothesis that the IDF soldiers are truly diabolical. That's what parasitic thinking looks like. So what are manifestations of ideological parasites? Well, all of these, you've probably heard of them by now, but of course the granddaddy of them is postmodernism, because that is the one that allows many of the other parasitic ideas to flourish. There are no objective truths other than the one objective truth, but there are no objective truths. If that's true, then men can be women. Up is down, left is right, slavery is freedom, and so on and so forth, right? And so postmodernism is truly a form of intellectual nihilism, what I call intellectual terrorism, right? If the 9/11 hijackers flew planes onto the buildings, postmodernists fly planes of bullshit into our edifices of reason. Let me give you a few examples from Canada, recent ones, and I'm only using examples from Canada because I'm Canadian. University of Waterloo, which is one of our top engineering computer science schools, had a call because, of course, everybody's now woken up to artificial intelligence, even though I'm proud to say that I was studying artificial intelligence in the mid-1980s as a math and computer science student. And so if you look at by the way, these are endowed professorships that are endowed by the Canadian government. So they're the most prestigious chair professorships. And so you would really think that this is where maybe we are really looking for excellence, and it's truly an ethos of meritocracy. Well, let's look at the first. This is not Shad Satire. This is literal, right? I'm taking a screenshot of the actual call. So for the first position, all areas of artificial intelligence are open. The call is open, though, only to qualified individuals who self-identify as women, transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, or true spirit. Now, this is, so at yesterday's event, sort of the working question was, is woke dead? No, it's not in Canada. This is at my own university, although I'm currently a visiting professor of the United States, but my home university, Concordia University, the bottom one is a project that's funded by our taxpayers that sought to, or seeks to, I think it's still ongoing, seeks to decolonize light, right? The physics of light, you know, the one where many physicists have won Nobel Prizes on, but they all suffer from something called original dermatological sin. They are white. And so we can't fully trust their knowledge, their epistemology. And so we're going to now indigenize the study of light, and the taxpayers are funding that. But that wasn't enough. And so we came up with a 5-year program, the 5-year strategic plan for Concordia University. The number one item is to decolonize and indigenize the entire curriculum. So it doesn't matter what you're teaching. So I study psychology of decision-making, consumer psychology, evolutionary psychology. I would have to do a good faith effort into decolonizing all those fields and indigenizing them. Now you know why I'm going to read the boxes. This, usually the setup for the story is quite funny, but I'm worried about the time, so I'll kind of just summarize it very quickly. In 2002, I had a conversation with the date of one of my doctoral students who had just defended his PhD, and I found out that she was a graduate student in women's studies, cultural anthropology, and postmodernism, to which I answered so the holy trinity of bullshit. And so I had asked her, you know, are there any universal truths? And she said no. And so what you're seeing here, the slides, I asked her is it not true that only women bear children within Homo sapiens? This is in 2002, so this is well before the transgender activism. And she said no, because there's a Japanese tribe on some Japanese island where within the mythological realm, it is the men who bear children. So by you keeping us barefoot and pregnant, this is what you do. So after I recovered from the mini stroke I had, I then asked her, is it not true that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? So there she pulled out Jacques Derrida, and she said, what do you mean by east and west? And what do you mean by the sun? That which you call the sun, I might call dancing hyena. I said, well, fine, the dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. She said, I don't play those label games. Now, why do I always repeatedly tell that story? It perfectly encapsulates what happens to the human mind. Once it is exposed to this kind of completely Darwinian good the sun. There's no epistemological exit from all this bullshit. If we can't agree 23 years ago that only women bear children, there's a thing called the sun, then where do we go from there? So I could have told you every single thing that we see today 25 years ago if people had cared to listen. Here, actually, this is a couple of slides that I didn't mention much yesterday. Well, I'd like to think I've said a couple of new things today from yesterday. So social constructivism and biophobia are two quite endemic parasitic ideas. Well, biophobia is the fear of reading biology to explain human behavior. And so these are actual marketing things where the very clever and progressive toy company reversed the typical roles, right? And so typically the argument is that toy preferences are socially constructed. And so if I want to demonstrate that this is simply not true, how would I go about demonstrating that? In other words, how can I build a network of evidence that is so unassailable that you have to concede that so far truth is on my side? So the next slide is actually a really important one, and I hope that sort of people take it and apply it in their own areas of research. So this is called a nomological network of cumulative evidence. In the center, I'm trying to prove to you that there is a sex specificity to toy preferences that is certainly sexually dimorphic, and then it discuss what would be the biological or evolutionary reasons for that. But if I wanted to convince you of that, how would I go about doing that? Well, I won't go through the entire network, but I'll go through enough of it to demonstrate this incredibly powerful epistemology. So I can get you data from developmental psychology, where I can show you that children who are too young to yet be socialized already exhibit those sex-specific thought preferences. So that already is incredibly powerful. It's a nail it. It's a in your coffin. But I'm not going to stop there. I can get you data from other species, from vervet monkeys, from rhesus monkeys, and from chimpanzees, showing you that their infants exhibit the exact same sex specificity. I can get you data from pediatric endocrinology, where little girls who suffer from congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which masquerades as the behavior of little girls, and then morphological features, I can show you that girls who suffer from that condition have an exact reversal of their thought preferences. They become akin to those of boys. Oh, but Professor Saad, you're talking about Western cultures. Oh no, I can get your data from sub-Saharan Africa that have absolutely nothing to do with the West, where they have the exact same thought preferences. Oh, but Professor Saad, this is all current time period. Oh, okay. I can get you data from 2,500 years ago, where on ancient funerary monuments, they're showing kids playing with the exact same types of toys as they do today. So I've gotten you data from across cultures, across time periods, across species, across methodologies, across disciplines, across dependent measures, all of which point to the veracity of my position. So one of the reasons I think that I haven't been so is because I always build my requisite chronological network. So if I go into an arena, and many times I go into very hostile arenas, and if I've already built the nomological network, good luck to you if you wish to debate it. So it's kind of hard to cancel me if I've got this backing me up. And so I would certainly implore you to sort of develop that methodology within your own debates. Let's talk quickly about ostrich parasitic syndrome. Ostrich parasitic syndrome is something that I discussed in chapter 6 of the parasitic mind, which is basically, of course, I mean, the ostrich doesn't literally do that, but it's become an apt metaphor for wanting to ignore reality, which is exactly one of the telltale conditions of someone who is parasitized. And so here what I've got, now this number keeps changing. This is, as of about a couple of weeks ago, 47,506 terror attacks by the beautiful and peaceful religion of Islam since 9/11 alone in 70 countries. And I can get you data that's even more, the number is bigger than that, from academic sources that are left-leaning. So you certainly you couldn't say it's because it's Zionist Gad who's coming up with this data, right? So I can triangulate the veracity of that. Now, in nearly every single one of those cases, the perpetrators will tell you exactly why they're doing it, and they will revoke their faith as to why they're doing it. But les bien-pensants in academia, the good thinkers, the politically correct folks that are much more highfalutin and have a progressive lisp and know much better than you can, have explained to us all these other reasons. Some of them, by the way, some of my colleagues here are friends with. I won't hold it against them. But let me just show you a few. I'll mention the same ones as yesterday, but I could have chosen other one. Look at the third one I'm really worried about because my son, who's 13, has been playing video games. And so I'm really, really worried that he's apt to being now recruited by ISIS as a Lebanese Jew. The fourth one is a really, really good one, very progressive analysis. It turns out that many of the attackers in Brussels, I think it was Brussels, they found out that it's because it could well be that during their teenage years, they hadn't been exposed to enough good art. And so, for example, as I explained yesterday at the event, my wife and I are assiduous in ensuring that, our children are exposed to Chagall, to Modigliani, to Picasso, to Klimt, because otherwise their chances of being recruited by ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood is really, really high. And then, of course, Bill Nye, who is, you have to take him seriously because he wears bow ties, plus he has the science guy in his title, so he must be a serious thinker. Explained to us that the Bataclan attack in Paris, where nearly 200 people were mowed down like little insignificant mosquitoes, was not due because of them screaming Allahu Akbar and then saying a whole bunch of other incantations from Islam. It's actually due to climate change. And by the way, if any of you don't believe any of this, you could read the Parasitic Mind and see those references. So a human being, to many of which many millions of people follow, argued with great emboldened sense of epistemological security that it was climate change that caused Muhammad to do what he did. That's what a parasitic climb looks like. Here I've got, because we're in Britain, I thought that I would bring this example up. I also did guess this. I'm just going to read a few names, which you'll appreciate because given the Arabic my mother found, you'll get that extra guttural enunciation. You have Muhammad Rizwan Haslam, you got Abdul Rahman, you've got Nahman Muhammad, you've got Wikas Mahmoud, you've got Muhammad Ifras, Muhammad Azim, Manzoor Hassan, Muhammad Akram. So I put it out on Twitter and I said, I'm not really sophisticated enough to understand if there is some kind of unifying theme across these 20 doers. And I got back as a serious answer by thousands of people, yes, Jew, this proves that it is the Jews who did it. You know how it's the Jews? Because who controls Britain's immigration policy? It's the Jews. It turns out also that the Jews control the immigration policy of Italy, of Spain, of Sweden. And as I mentioned at yesterday's party, I'm the king of the Jews, and yet I've never been invited to any of those meetings. But this is what happens to a parasitic mind. Let me just briefly, I'm a bit over time, but I'll try to wrap it up. Suicidal empathy then extends the story, and let me explain the framework of suicidal empathy. There are many psychiatric disorders which are only psychiatric disorders because they become hyperactive or hypoactive, right? So pseudo-bulbar affect is where you start laughing hysterically, as you saw in the Joker. Well, laughter actually has some evolutionary signatures, but not in the way that occurs with pseudo-bulbar affect, right? Crying could be an adaptive mechanism, but it's not good when crying comes at inopportune times when you shouldn't be crying. So it's not that empathy is a wrong thing, right? Empathy is actually an evolutionary-based virtue. It is part of what oils our sociality. So empathy is great. Suicidal empathy is when it is targeting the wrong people at the wrong time at the wrong place. And so once the empathy module misfires, you end up with a slew of domestic and foreign policies that are exactly what we're seeing in the West. So fasten your seatbelt for the next book. So I'll just very quickly, I had a whole bunch of other slides. I'll end it with the two final slides. So how to save our universities, and I'm going to specifically focus on these two slides because we're at an academic conference. Number one, pursue knowledge unencumbered by ideological activism. No knowledge is forbidden if it is honestly pursued using the scientific method. Freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, and the pursuit of truth are deontological principles. Don't adhere to a consequentialist ethics when it comes to these kinds of principles. No more identity politics and all that bullshit. No more coddling of the culture of offense and the ethos of perpetual victimhood. A just society is rooted in the ethos of a meritocracy. I see Stephen Victor here, and I know that E.O. Wilson was at his university. Yeah, E.O. Wilson famously said, he recently passed away. He's a social ant expert, where social ants are communistic. When he was asked, Professor Wilson, what are your comments or what are your views on socialism/communism? He said, great idea, wrong species, right? So the phylogenetic history of a species matters. It makes sense for us to be communistic if we're social ants, not as much if we are human beings. Promote an ethos of intellectual and political diversity. Of course, you all know this already. All ideas, beliefs, and ideologies are open to ridicule and criticism. One of the things that I do in my work, let me just skip here. I want to read you this quote, and then I'll wrap up with the things that I'll be done. How much truth is contained in something can be best determined by making it thoroughly laughable and then watching to see how much joking around it can take. For truth is a matter that can stand mockery, that is freshened by any ironic gesture directed at it. Whatever cannot stand satire is false. Any of you who follow me know that I am a very ardent user of ridicule, sarcasm, mockery, not because I can't put on a professorial hat, but because sarcasm is actually terribly effective in getting the point across, especially when you're dealing with ludicrous ideas. So let me wrap up with the list of things to save the West, and I'll cede the floor. Number 8, promote an ethos of interdisciplinarity, consilience, and methodological pluralism. Number 9, which is really important, because most academics
are part of the new species that I have discovered. They're called the invertebrate castrati. They have neither sperm nor testicles, and that is absolutely true.
So encourage bold thinking. Academia should be about the forming of intellectual Navy SEALs and not bean counters. There is no group that is more cowardly than academics. I guarantee you, I promise you, despite the fact that institutionally they should be the most courageous because technically we have this thing called tenure. It doesn't stop the fact that if I go boo, they all run away. Number 10, strike the right balance between specialization and generalization. Number 11, remove the stifling bureaucracies in academia. So for example, now if I want to run a study, I'm way more afraid of going through the institutional review board than actually doing the study because it took me 474 years to go through all of the degenerate bullshit that they put me through. And then finally, science, reason, logic, and a commitment to evidence-based thinking, trump ideology, hurt feelings, factual anti-science, and full intellectual gibberish. Thank you very much.
So we go to questions and discussion. We're going to make room for our second speaker. Just put the set that we. Bastian Gasagon is going to speak on Wokeness is a smokescreen for class, as many of you know, Bastian's most known for her two books, both of which I'm ready to have read. Second Class, How Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women, which has been everywhere recently, and I was pleased to join back on the discussion about that recently in the US. And Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, how the media class has basically lost the plot. Actually, the floor is yours.
My first book is my better book, not least because Zach Goldberg and Nassar Al-Gharbi are quoted at length in it. They're the best parts of it, and makes us far better than my second book. But my second book is the more important one because it's about the American working class. Who is the American working class, and do they still have access to the American dream? Which is the question we should be asking. Hence the title of my talk, that wokeness is a smokescreen for class. I've only been here for about 24 hours, but everyone talks to me about these rape gangs. I only found out about them, actually, because Elon Musk tweeted about them. I'm very focused on my own country. I'm a huge patriot and really only care about America. That's something I probably shouldn't admit. So he tweeted about them, and so suddenly everybody in my country was talking about these grooming gangs. And lost in the conversation was the fact that he only tweeted about them to distract from the fact that he had majorly pissed off the MAGA base that he had now joined by saying that we should be importing exponentially more H-1B visa holders, which made me like me very angry. Because the whole point of the MAGA movement is to give working class people a shot at the American dream, which of course is, you know, completely contradictory to bringing in lots of people to work in these white-collar jobs from other countries who are going to do them for much less. And I think that's kind of like a nice metonymy for how I see the whole anti-woke movement, which is that it's a little bit of a distraction from a much more important economic question. You know, I usually say something that I hope doesn't offend you. I usually say something like, it would have been fine if wokeness had just sort of stayed in academia, you know? You guys probably don't think that's fine, but it would have been sort of fine in a much more general sense. It wouldn't have exploded. And the reason that it exploded out of university, unlike a lot of the other crazy ideas that, you know, cooked up over, you know, the last centuries, is because it was very much in the economic interests of the elites to divert attention from the real divide, which is the class divide, and talk about these racial or gender categories. The thing that I'm going to say here that's probably less popular is that I think the anti-woke movement is doing a very similar thing. It's very much in the interests of some elites to be woke, and it's very much in the interests of other elites to be anti-woke, because of course it allows them to be in true veto of everything. And I think that that mindset is equally on both sides of it. So we had this great talk last night. I gotta tell you, I didn't realize there was something better than being applauded by a room full of people, and it's actually being booed by a room full of people after you tell them that you can't just denaturalize citizens because they happen to be Muslims. And this is so, I mean, the shock on my face. A young Orthodox Jewish boy, I'm an Orthodox Jew, a young Orthodox Jewish boy stood up and said, no, we are guests in this country, in a pristine British accent. And I'm telling you this because I will be haunted by that for a very long time. It is horrifying, the idea that the citizens of your country are somehow guests because of their faith. My country was founded on the opposite of that. And so if that's the end game of the anti-woke stuff, I will be your enemies. All right. Why is wokeness a smokescreen for class? It's related to this question of why wokeness is dying in a very big way in America, because we are in the midst of a populist revolt against the elites, very much because of Donald Trump, who represented the MAGA movement, which is itself a massive and multiracial populist working class agenda. And here I divert from Eric. To me, class is very much about education, not about income. What we've seen in the United States over the last 50 years is a political realignment around class, to where it used to be that the Republicans were sort of the party of wealthy and trickle-down economics and all this stuff, and the Democrats represented labor, and now the working class votes for MAGA for Trump. It's not really Republicans. I could talk about that, that's interesting. And meanwhile, the rich now are mostly Democrats. Most rich people in America are Democrats. And this realignment means that the Democratic Party is now an uneasy coalition between very poor people who rely on government benefits and very wealthy, educated people. And it is the working class who are the hardest working Americans who've been cut out of the prosperity. What happened over the last 50 years was the Democrats built an economy that was an upward transfer of wealth from labor into the pockets of the educated. So in the 70s, which was the sort of high watermark for a working class purchasing power, the largest share of the wealth in my country was in the middle class. People who worked in factories were middle class, at a middle class standard of living. And that's not separable from the fact that 25% of our economy, the largest share, was in manufacturing, which is, of course, why tariffs are so important, because they're bringing back that manufacturing. Today, the largest share of our economy, 20%, is financed in real estate, meaning it's in the hands of the asset rich. And top 10%, which is not the billionaires, it's the people in this room, control over 60% of the GDP. And the way that they did that was through successive policy decisions that took money from their working class neighbors and put it in their own pockets. For example, having a very lax immigration agenda. So for elites, immigration is about culture. For working class people, it's about economics. It's about having a tight labor market if you control immigration, or a very wise labor market where you can ask for fewer wages. And in fact, those wages that you can no longer command because your elite neighbor who's a doctor, who's married to a professor, who needs childcare so that they can both work, they can now pay somebody from Haiti, and they don't have to give them health care, and they don't have to pay them a living wage. So immigration is a really big part of how the elites basically, it's actual wage theft. It is a plundering of people who work much harder than them, and they accepted them to accept it. And then they'll show you these slides, sorry I'm running the slide, but they'll show you these slides that show that, homes today have, much more homes have air conditioning than they did in the 70s. Like the expectation of what their neighbors should suffice with and be satisfied with compared to how they are living is godless. And it's why people were so angry, and it's where the populist revolt came from. Very, very bloodless. It's a very chill. They just voted for the person that the elites hate more than anybody else on the planet. And the reason they hate him is because he was trying to do right by the electorate. So immigration, free trade is another one of the ways in which the elites plundered the working class and the middle class. They defunded vocational training. So it used to be that a child in America, a young man who maybe has the character traits that God was talking about, not great at sitting, for long periods of time, not super great at, following instructions from people or, being submissive to authority, had a great avenue into the middle class, because in their high school, they would be taught how to weld. And that was funded by Democrats because they decided everyone should go to college. Of course, college being the number one predictor for whether you're a Democrat, right? So we basically had this economy that was by the same people who were claiming to be on the side of the little guy and on the side of labor and on the side of the working class, were actually navigating politically and economically in this way that was stealing from their neighbors who they were pretending to represent and to stand for. And on the other side, you had the GOP before Trump, which was very much geared towards the rich, the trickle-down economics, the country clubs. It was very pro-corporation. And I think when you look at why the woke ideology became so popular, not just in the academy, but as Zach has showed so well, filtered through the media and then became utterly mainstream among the college educated in America, the 30% of Americans who have that degree, the 20% who work in the knowledge industry, and the 10% who are in the top 10% in the elites. The reason it took hold was because it was a perfect alibi for the sin that they were committing against their neighbors. It was a justification for the shipping of men's jobs in manufacturing overseas to China to build up China's middle class. So that when those men objected, they said, that's your toxic masculinity speaking, that you think you should have the right to use your physical body to feed your family and to protect your wife and your children. And the racial moral panic happened in a very similar way. When working class people said, wait a minute, why are we worked so hard and you sold our future and our children's future out to our greatest adversaries, they said, oh, well, you're racists. And when they said, well, you opened the border and now suddenly I was a janitor, I used to own a home. My kids now have no hope of ever achieving what I did because there's now millions more people working in 5 very specific industries. By the way, the vast majority of the people working in those industries are still Americans. There are no jobs that Americans don't want to do. When they objected to that, they said, how dare you? You are racist for wanting to have a national border. We have so much. We're the richest country on the planet. How dare you deprive the global indigent of a shot at the American dream? These unbelievably wealthy people who were controlling 60% of the GDP said to people whose children were dying of fentanyl overdoses because they have no future in this country. So, of course, you see how the language of wokeness, which basically says there's no right versus wrong, there's no nation state, there's no concept of citizenship or what we owe each other or noblesse oblige. Maybe I owe something to this country that made me so wealthy. Wokeness is basically saying we're going to throw away the distinction between right versus wrong. And instead, we're going to have a distinction between powerful versus powerless. Oh, how do you know who has power in which situation? Oh, we'll use skin color. It's so easy. It's so obvious. You gender. It's so obvious, right? And then instead using that as a shorthand for virtue. They don't mean it. What they meant for it to do was to hide their crimes against their neighbors. I think a lot of the data backs this up. I for my second class, I traveled around the country. I interviewed hundreds of working class people from all political backgrounds. They had a very unified way of seeing the world, whether they voted Republican and Democrat. They were actually quite unified and very emotionally unified, very emotionally attached to this country. The polarization that we see is like an utterly elite phenomenon. There's no issue that they really disagreed on. The conservatives were very pro-gay, and the Democrats were very, very anti-trans. Like that kind of a thing. They all thought there was tons of abuse and welfare and did not want more welfare, but they wanted to tax the rich, including the Republicans, the conservatives. So the working class in America is very, very united around a whole bunch of issues. They are economically populist, they're anti-war, and they're socially moderate, which of course is the agenda that got Donald Trump into the White House. And the opposition to him is so much about that. If you think back to 2018, the bottom 25% of wage earners. I'm not talking about the poor again. I'm talking about the working class, people who work. Bottom 25% of wage earners saw a 4% wage increase, and the top 25% only saw a 2.5% wage increase, which means that Trump was the first president to shrink the income gap in about 60 years. And this is the kind of thing that nobody talked about it because, of course, Republicans didn't care, and Democrats don't want to give him any credit for it. But the policies here that he is enacting in the name of working class people are going to continue to unify working class people and bring them
together, but also they're weakening the elites. And you're seeing this thing as war on Harvard, to where, aside from just like the amazing service to the United States of exposing the fact that $2 billion a year taxpayer dollars are going to educate Xi Jinping's daughter and other, future apparatchiks of the Chinese Communist Party, that is class warfare on behalf of a forgotten, elected, ignored working class who deserved a lot better. So I think that a lot of in America, it feels to me like a lot of the wokeness is sort of fading because the economic prospects of the working class are improving. And it was the economic prospects of the working class that wokeness became popularized in order to conceal. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I had to be.
Let's open up for some questions and discussion. If we could turn the lights back on as well, and just look at one of the organizers. I'm afraid my eyesight's terrible, so I'm just going to point at people. Check from the blazer, chap over there. Go.
Yeah. So I have a question. The last speaker there, actually, you're sympathetic to this argument than you may like, possibly because in this country, I think class is a never. I grew up in South Wales, so class is never, one of the places that hated backdrop underneath. But one of the I happen to agree that I think that a lot of work was a smokescreen that in a way was a method of containing a genuine, authentic left that was arising there in the late 2000s. But then, funnily enough, we get capitalism that got this way of containing things, and you had this whole thing of woke capitalism or corporate wokeness, which then somehow contain all of any of the kind of dissident energy that wokeness may have had. My question for you is, you're kind of painting MAGA as this authentic working class movement. But I've already started to see, I remember there was that big campaign against Bud Light. And then Bud Light, really cynically, they started changing the messaging on the advertising. And it's like, Bud Light, we support the veterans. So I'm just wondering what kind of protections could be in place for MAGA as a phenomena being co-opted by capital C capital, by the corporations, and essentially just becoming like another kind of fake thing like one was. So
Right. We just take the question. We'll take a bunch. We'll just take one over here as well. Yeah, behind you, yeah.
Thank you. I think the two questions I have are directly to...
Try and keep them brief.
Yep, two very brief questions directed to Gab.
Yeah, authoritarian.
I'm a bit of a ask question authoritarian as well. So there's this word buzzing around, I think kind of Eric used it as well, it's called data. And I'm very, very suspicious of data, because it wasn't that long ago when we were locked up in our homes because the data told us we had to be locked up in our homes. So I think there's a real danger that in defending science and defending rational thought, that we end up reinventing their version of scientism. So less data, please. Second very quick question is saving the university. Why? I think we should bury it myself, because it seems to be the key driver, the key institutional mechanism why this erosion of Western culture is occurring. So why save the university?
Okay, great. Why save the university? Do we have a mic for the speakers? Yep. Why save the university? Why should we have faith in science? Is MAGA being co-opted?
I mean, I can answer the why save the university, the class stuff.
There are a lot of things that are wrong with the university, as I mentioned in my talk. All of the parasitic ideas originally stem from the university ecosystem. There are also immeasurable good that comes out of universities, right? So if I were to take a percentage of all the professors and all of the students who go about their business doing great stuff as a proportion of the people who are espousing and promulgating and being parasitized by this nonsense, the ratio is still very favorable. So I don't think we need to, nuclear bomb these universities. We need to simply find a way to inoculate people against some of these dreadful ideas. Now, these ideas do cause, an inordinate amount of damage downstream, right? At times, they also become prime ministers of countries. Justin Trudeau, who is both the exemplar of parasitic thinking and of suicidal thinking. So I'm not minimizing the extent of these parasitic ideas. Obviously, I cooked the book, but it would be silly to say, let's just nuke the whole thing. Now, by the way, just as a final point, there are also attempts to create new institutions from the ground up and hopefully not make the same mistakes as the existing universities. But I think it would be maybe a bit harsh to say, let's get rid of the whole intramus.
I'm with you. I think they're worthless. I need to get rid of them. I think even the sciences are so corrupted by the process of getting things published. I'm with you. My God, could you even imagine if corporate America wanted to co-opt the tariffs? I would be dancing for joy. This is a real materialist agenda that's putting money in the pockets of working class people. Everyone is welcome. If Walmart, instead of being like, we're going to raise taxes, said, you know what, we're going to eat this as an act of patriotism because we are asking working class people to eat the cost so that their children will have a better life. By the way, something they're happy to do because as one truck driver explained to me last week, sacrificing for my kids is what it means to be working class. And we're not going to ask the elites to do the same thing. We're not going to ask corporate America to do the same thing. There have been, I think it was GM said, we're going to take down our projected profits from 15 billion to 10 billion. That's tariffs for you, baby. That's great. That's they want to metabolize the MAGA agenda. I could not be happier. If private organizations want to donate to policing the poor, it could be great. There's very little that can be actually co-opted because it's not a symbolic movement. It's just good, obvious policy that was democratic policy to put money in the pockets of working class people for 100 years. Having a strong, illegal border crossings are down to 3 a day. I don't see how you really co-opt that. It's just good policy for a nation. But I take your point.
Okay, let's get some questions. We've got one up in the corner. We've got 2 up in the corner. I'm going to make our way around the hallway. Let's keep the questions brief. Yeah.
No, definitely very much. Really entertaining as well as your boy. The short question is, in this country, our politicians despise the working class and adore woke universities. Your suggestions?
So in my country, that was true until a certain person came along who had just a very obvious love of the people. You have to shame them about it. It has to be relentless shame about having contempt for people who work so much harder than us and have so much less to show for it. Just relentless shame and stop asking about the woke stuff. What are you going to do to make housing more affordable? What are you going to do to protect the product of the labor of the working man and woman? I think it's just relentless shaming them out of their contempt.
There was a question just in front over here, and then we're going to come down the hello.
To synthesize some points earlier, isn't the progressive ideology really a reaction to the collapse of socialism on the left? The left reinvented itself by creating endless victim groups, the neurodiverse, ethnic minorities, women, etc. This also then generates a group feature of the bureaucratic class with forced HR codes who have to be graduates. That creates the new left, 21st century, and the new right is populist right and fighting against it. The problem seems to be that there is a different split between within the new right, between people who think the state should be used to support the working class and create a new group that the state back, and the sort of more classical liberal people who think that the problem is that the government has got bigger and bigger. Because I thought lots of your analysis was great, but isn't the problem that the state's bigger than its own regulatory share of state spending? So it's weird to then say the problem is that our state is not big enough when it's never been larger.
I'll answer very briefly. Donald Trump has done something I've never seen done before, which is he's combined very pro-worker things like closing the border. Wall Street hates that, and tariffs. Wall Street hates that. In fact, Wall Street donated more to the Democratic candidate than to Donald Trump for 3 cycles in a row. So the rich have solidly picked the Democrats. Donald Trump has combined just specifically, and I don't know if this would work for the UK context. Unfortunately, I'm very vocally ignorant of anything outside my own country, but he combined that with very pro-business stuff, like massive deregulation, cheap energy, and slashing the corporate tax rate. They're now negotiating whether, raising taxes on the wealthy should be part of the pro-worker stuff, or if they should slash taxes on the wealthy, put that in the pro-business side. I think they should put it in the labor side. But so he's combined massive deregulation and pro-business goodies with the more pro-labor stuff. He's not actually they're not doing a good enough job of controlling the deficit, but they're also not trying to give the job of increasing the fortunes of the working class to the government. In fact, he's trying to make industry pay for it with the tariffs. He just went on this trick. He got $6 trillion committed to building manufacturing back in the United States. So he's trying this thing out of, can we get private industry to pay for the things that they made go basically awry in our economy? I don't know if it'll work, but I think that dichotomy, like in America, the sort of classical liberal thing is very much just like some plaything of Bill Heats. It does not have any, just like libertarianism, it does not have a foothold. There's no constituency that it represents.
Just before we come to Helen, what I was saying, Gad, you want to come in on the emails?
I mean, I was just going to say that a lot of the questions allude to sort of a top-down process whereby, there are evil puppeteers of one political persuasion or another that are doing this stuff in order for whatever purpose that they have. And maybe there's a bit of truth to that, but I believe the evidence is quite clear that a lot of these parasitic ideas and suicidal empathy stem from a frailty of the architecture of the human mind and frailty in our emotional system to be hijacked. And so many of these parasitic ideas did not start off, with any specific political downstream effect, whether it be class-based or so. Franz Boas and his friends were the originators of cultural relativism. And the reason why they thought that was a good idea is because if you would argue that biology is relevant in explaining human behavior, all sorts of political cretins might misuse it. So now let's create new edifices of knowledge in anthropology, in economics, in sociology, where biology ceases to matter. So the origins of cultural relativism, which now finds itself in many of our policy decisions, had nothing to do with sort of a top-down, willful manipulation of the people. So I think it would be incorrect to presume that all of this bad thinking stems from nefarious folks in the background that are doing their doctrines.
Helen?
I'm about one thing that I would like to articulate is how to really kind of solidify, concretize the language that's going on here. Because I see a lot of things that cause shit here. When we're talking, for example, about a parasitic mind virus, how are we going to be careful that this does not fly into the whole sort of like regularity thing? Whereas I'm used to being told that this is my whiteness speaking. I need to dismantle my whiteness, decolonize my thinking, to detoxify the masculinity. How can we be certain that, well, you would think like that because you've been parasitized by a woke mind virus? I have been, apparently. I'm cued to this more often now. And also the concept of elites. How can we make sure that this doesn't go the same way as privilege? Whereas if you are disagreeing with me, there will be grounds on which you can be found to be privileged and that to explain it. Whereas if you're agreeing with me, then you're not fitting in that. Because when I'm hearing that, for example, the richest man in the world who owns the largest social media platform and the president of the United States are not elites, I feel we're kind of losing all handwritten not
Just cool. So a great question. If I can just abuse my position, Gad, what's the intersection between
the parasitic mind and social status, because in Britain, when I think about what you've been saying, and I agree on much of it, if I look at, say, a political party like the Conservative Party, the Tory Party, much of their refusal to take on wokeness or radical progressivism, I would argue, has been rooted more in their desire to, as they see it, uphold their social status among certain elite communities, to not get dragged into the low-status culture wars, rather than perhaps their thinking being hijacked by a particular mindset. Rob Henderson, among others, have made this point about social status, so we can add that in too, and how we define the elites as well about you.
Sort of like answer first question. I mean, I think there is a very tight definition of what constitutes a parasitic idea. So it's not Jack Derrida. It could be whatever you want it to be. But that said, to your point about incorporating political element, I never argue, although I don't mean to imply that we insinuated this, that it's only people on the left that could be parasitized by a specific set of ideas. It turns out that the parasitic ideas that I talk about in the book all stem from the left, because they all stem from academia, and most academics happen to be on the left. But people on the right could also be fully parasitized. So let me give you an example from my own work. Evolution is much more likely to be rejected by people on the right for whatever reasons that they hold. Where's my God, if Darwin's right, and so on. Evolutionary psychology, which is the application of evolution to the study of the human mind, is much more likely to be rejected by people on the left. So again, many of the discussions here, and I'm not exactly sure why, are always revolving around a political party and class warfare and so on. I'm talking about an endemic feature and frailty in the architecture of the human mind that makes it prone to be parasitized by alluring ideas that are fully decoupled from reality. And it's not difficult to demonstrate what constitutes a parasitic idea. When 6'4" John with a 9-inch penis becomes a lady tomorrow when he's called Linda, that's a parasitic idea. It doesn't take much to understand what is the semantic contours of that.
As a person who calls myself a MAGA lefty, I have the distinct pleasure of rejecting both evolution and evolutionary.
It's back to the drawing board for Steven picture. Oculus rejected it. Should wasted 31 years.
So, how to define elites? In my book, Second Class, where I argue that the class divide of America is the most salient feature, I define working class as somebody who works full-time in an industry that does not require skills you would have learned in college and university, and who's been locked out of the top 20%. This is of all sociological definitions, the one that correlated them the most strongly with the downward mobility I was trying to describe, and also with how people see themselves. In terms of the elites, I mean, I totally hear what you're saying, but if people are in the top 10%, I think we would all agree, like and especially if that top 10% is controlling such a disproportionate share of the GDP, at that point, and that is correlated with having 1 or 2 degrees. We're talking about a very specific coterie that's very, I think, easy to measure. Of course, Elon Musk, the richest man on the planet, Donald Trump, very, very wealthy. But what I found, this is obviously not scientific, but from my qualitative analysis of interviewing people, working class people very much don't see billionaires as anathema to their interests. They often see them as jobs creators and admire them very much and want to be like them. So they don't see that as they do see these kind of like the people that, the wokes, as very much anathema to their interests, as having controlled an unfair share of the pie, which I think the research that pure economic raw research shows is very much true, and sees them as constantly looking down on them and sneering at them. And while elites look at Trump and they see he doesn't really care about the working class people see him in his tie, putting on a McDonald's apron, and they feel like he respects what I do. Like it's that they see him in a truck and they say, I mean, this is how it's read. And I understand that to people who are not in that, it doesn't quite make sense. People really struggle to understand that. But I think from a purely, like the resentment that the top 10% has for the top 1%, it far outstrips the resentment that working class people seem to have, at least in America, for billionaires. There's a lot of healthy respect for capitalism.
Okay. The last questions at the top are the last things between now and the coffee break. So let's keep it really efficient and the answers as well.
Okay, my question for each of you is, what's the right number? So, Batya, what's the right number for immigrants that a country should allow in? Between 0 and 100, and is there some rational basis based on some moral principles that we could arrive at? Again, what's the right percentage of tax on your books? Noticed you complained on
That's you putting me in a bad way.
But let me just say, brother, I feel your pain. I'll feel your pain. In other words, is there some progress we could make to making rational arguments about political questions like that? Or is it just whoever's in power gets to make those things?
What's the right number?
It's less than 58%. And actually 58% only constitutes the two taxes of the federal and provincial. On the 42% that I'm allowed to keep, then they take 15% sales tax when I spend, and then property tax, and then school tax, and so on. So by the end of the year, I'm left at roughly maybe 30% of my income. 30%. So if we put that in terms of from January 1st, how long do I worry for free for the government until I get my escape velocity? It's around September. So from January to September, I am a slave, and I become slightly free starting in September. So I don't know what the exact number is, but it's a lot less than whatever it is now. That's why in the current folks Suicidal Empathy, I have a whole section on parasitic taxation.
I think that's why so many Brits are moving to Dubai.